Praise the Lord. I'd like to welcome you to our Sunday school class for today. It is my prayer that you have been doing good this week. So let's look and see what God says in His Word. And today we are going to be looking at the deliverance of the Jews. The deliverance of the Jews. And we're going to be using the Union Gospel Press Sunday School book. And if you do not have a book, you can follow along in your Bible. So we're coming from Esther chapter 8, verses 3 through 8, and then Esther 9, verses 18 to 23. So here we find that this lesson is about as it says, the deliverance of the Jews. And so a problem has already come about, and this problem stems around with a person named Haman, who was bent on annihilating the Jews. And so we come to this point. We're going to have to back up a little bit, but we come to the point where it is here that it is speaking where Esther and Mordecai are trying to reverse some things of a decree that Haman talked to the King Ahasuerus about, and got King Ahasuerus to sign off on him annihilating the Jews. So let's take a look at this, and we're going to do a little backdrop of the story, but let's read what it says here, and let's talk about Esther's petition, and let's read what it says here in Esther 8 and 3. And it says, "And Esther spake yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his device that he had devised against the Jews. Then the king held out the golden scepter towards Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king." So what had happened before, and that Haman had drawn up? Haman was promoted by the king. He was a servant to the king, and he was the highest in the land after the king. And so he devised this plan because there was Mordecai, who was a Jew and Esther's cousin. And so the king had decreed that everybody bow before Haman. Well, Mordecai wouldn't do it. And so Mordecai had devised this plan to annihilate the Jews as a result of it. And so, as we had studied before, the decree had went out across the land, and it was the signet ring of the king was there on the decree that had gone out and had been posted in the provinces. It was supposed to happen that on that 13th day that the people were to be annihilated. And so it was that in this 5th chapter, we see where Esther has put on her royal robe, and this is leading up to this point. Esther has put on her royal robe, and she is interceding. She is going to stand in the courtyard, because before we had talked about how no one could go in unto the king unless they were invited, and this was the same thing that had happened with Esther. And so I want to show you some things back. It's not in the Sunday school book, but it's important to take a look at some of the things that had happened before. So in the book of Esther, the Mordecai, in that 4th chapter, he had cried out and put on his sackcloths and ashes. He was mourning because of this decree that was going to go out. Esther had sent garments in to him, and then we know that it comes sent clothing out to Mordecai to change out of his sackcloth and ashes, but he wouldn't change out of it. He had this discussion with Esther as to what she needed to do, And what she had needed to do was to go in and appeal to the king to save the Jews. And so in this 5th chapter, we see that Esther has put on her royal clothes. And when she's put on her royal clothes, she goes to stand out in the courtyard because she wants the king to see her, because she needs to have a discussion with the king. But she knew that she could not go in beforehand without the king inviting her to come in, or this could mean death. Prior to this, the Jews had prayed, and Esther had prayed so that she would not die, because she needed to intervene on behalf of the Jews. And so it was that the king saw her standing there in the courtyard looking all pretty, so he called her in. So he called her in, and he wanted to know what is it that she wished of him. And he said that whatever it was, he would give it to her up to the half of the kingdom. And so what Esther says in chapter 5 of verse 4 of Esther, she says, and she answered him, she says, if it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet that I have prepared for him. And so at the banquet, they came, and at the banquet, it was the king asked Esther again, what is your petition? And it shall be granted to you. And again, he talked about it being up to half of the kingdom. So Esther is working on this plan because God has been talking to Esther. And in between that time of prayer and when they were praying before Esther would go into the king, Esther had been praying. And it doesn't say that she was praying here, but they were fasting. And so normally prayer goes with fasting. And so they had petitioned. She's here and she's at this banquet with Haman. And the king is wanting to know what is it that she wants even at this banquet. And so Esther says to the king, after he says, what is your petition? She says, my petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, if it please the king, she said, to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I shall prepare for them tomorrow. And I will do, she says, tomorrow, and I will do as the king has said. And so this is in the 7th, that 5th chapter, that 7th verse. So Haman's been invited to this banquet. He's all puffed up because he was puffed up when he got promoted to a higher level, and everybody was to pay homage to him, but only Mordecai wouldn't do it. So he was puffed up against Mordecai, and he had found out that Mordecai was a Jew, and he had this decree to kill all the Jews just because Mordecai, or some call him Mordecai, would not bow down. And so Esther has this plan in place, and so Haman's eating at this banquet that the queen prepared for herself. So he goes home. He tells everybody that he got invited to this banquet. He calls his friends and his family, and he's all puffed up and telling them he's been promoted. He's just really proud of himself that he's second in the kingdom to the king. And so, but he says that all of this doesn't matter as long as he got to see this Mordecai out here sitting at the gate and won't bow and give him homage when he comes in. So he's happy about being invited to the king, but it's just spoiling it, because when he left that banquet, he had to see Mordecai still out there not paying him homage. So here it is that Mordecai has talked to his family, he's talked to his friends, and they come up with this plan. And so in that 5th chapter, at that 14th verse, it says, then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, well then, let gallows be made 50 cubits high in the morning, and suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it, and then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And that thing pleased Haman. So that's the plan. I'm going to get Mordecai. He going to hang on these gallows. And so it was that Haman had these gallows built. And so it was that God is in control. God is always in control. And so God's got this thing in control, that God is going to do what only God can do. And he calls something to happen. God calls for the king not to be able to sleep. And then these chronicles were read. And so the king found out that it actually was Mordecai who at one time had saved his life, when in that 6th chapter, when Bigthan and Teresh, these were doorkeepers and eunuchs that were in the king's household, they sought to kill the king, but Mordecai told about the story, and that saved the king. King wanted to know what would happen. What would happen? And so what had happened, did anybody ever give something to Mordecai for saving him? Was he ever honored? And then the king found out that he wasn't. Then the king wanted to know who was out there in the courtyard, and it was Haman. So it says that the king wanted to honor Mordecai. And he said, the king said to Haman, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? So now Mordecai, who Haman hates, is getting favor now from the king. Won't God change situations and cause things where your enemies come up against you to turn around and to work in your favor? So the king wants to honor Mordecai. And so Haman thinks that when the king says that to him, because he had to come now in to the king, he thinks that the king wants to honor him. So Haman's all puffed up. And so Haman thinks that since it's him and he's going to answer the king, he comes up with this plan that the king will get a robe that the king has worn, and then get one of the horses that the king's ridden on, and the horse that has this crest on his head, and make this big pomp and circumstance, then give this robe to one of the officials that's in the king's, one of the king's noble princes, and then have them take the robe and put it on the man that the king wants to honor, and then have that nobleman to lead the man that the king wants to honor on a horse and walk him through the town square. So Haman's thinking all this time, this is going to be about me, and pomp and circumstances he's built up. So anyway, long story made short, the king says, well, do that to Mordecai and don't leave nothing out. Boy, that got Haman a goat. So Haman had to go get Mordecai, put the robe on him. Haman had to put it on him in front of everybody. Haman had to lead him through the city square. And then he had to say, this is the man that the king has chosen, who delights to honor. After that was over, won't God make your enemies be your footstool? When God is wanting to show you the favor, God can do whatever he wants to do. And this is what he did in this case. So then afterwards, Mordecai went back to the king's gate. He was back in that mourning. And then Haman went home mourning to his family. He had to tell them what had happened. He told his family what had happened. And the wise men what had happened that day. And so this is what was said. Now this is a prophetic word. God will move in your behalf. God will make your enemies be your footstool. So always keep this in mind. Let God do what God is going to do. And so in that 6th chapter, this is what was said. And this is really, really prophetic. This is what was said by it says, when Haman told his wife Zeresh, I'm at that 13th verse, when Haman told his wife Zeresh and all the friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife said to him, because now their wisdom before was hang Mordecai on the gallows. Now their wisdom is, if Mordecai before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. And that's what's beginning to happen. You do not have to fight up against your enemies. You only have to let God do what God is going to do. You serve God, and God will deal with the enemies. So that sets up what happened. And so then they went back to this next banquet, and then when and as the words were being spoken, while they were talking, the people came to get Haman to go to this second banquet. When he gets to the second banquet, he gets in. The king again asked Queen Esther what she wanted. He would give it up to her, the half of the kingdom. And over in that 7th chapter of Esther, it says at that 3rd verse, this is what the king answered after the king asked. This is what the queen answered after King Ahasuerus asked her what she wanted. And this is what she said. I'm talking about Esther, the 7th chapter, and that 3rd verse. Esther answered him and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue altogether. The enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So then King Ahasuerus, he answered, he asked her, he said, who is he and where is he who would dare presume his heart to do such a thing? And Esther says, the adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified. The king arose in his wrath, and then he left and went into the garden. And Haman stood before the queen and Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined up against him by the king. And when the king returned, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. The king thought, are you going to assault the queen while I am in the house? And so as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's head. And so what happened was they said, the eunuch said to the king, look, the gallows 50 feet high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. So then they said the gallows that was supposed to be for hanging for Haman, that were for the hanging of Mordecai, are at Haman's house. So the king sent and said, hang Haman on those gallows. God will make your enemies be your footstool. God will take care of what he needs to take care of. All we have to do is to obey God. So that is what happened in that story. God will make your enemies be your footstool. So then here it was that golden scepter. Now Esther has come in verse 3 of Esther 8, and she wants to appeal to the king. She's come in, she's fell down before him, she's honoring him as her husband, and then she wants to get rid of this stuff that Haman has done, because this decree is still out there to kill the Jews. Even though Haman is dead, the decree is still out there. The king holds this golden scepter out to Esther. Esther goes in unto the king to speak to the king, and then when he holds out this scepter, she touches this scepter, she arose and she stood before the king. And so God is working things out the way that he wants it worked out in this instant. She's showed honor to the king, and she's went in. So we got to know that she's now in the presence of the king. Prayer has gone out, and when we make fervent intercession, even before human authorities, is often needed to avert evils in the world. And so let's look at Esther's appeal, and let's read Esther 8, 5 through 6. It says, and said, if it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews which are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that shall come unto my people, or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? So Esther has the respect of the king, but this decree is still out there that Haman wrote. It's irreversible. And we find that even in Daniel, there's this story about how Daniel's enemies wanted to destroy him because he had this favor. And so Daniel had this thing about praying unto the Lord. They knew that the enemies knew that they could get Daniel with his praying. So Daniel's enemies went before King Darius, and they came up with this thing that if the king would agree to issue an edict, and these were the people that were the royal magistrates, the satraps, the advisors, and the governors. The same way that Haman went before King Ahasuerus in the book of Daniel, they go before King Darius. They want King Darius to write this decree. And so they say that write this decree and this edict and enforce it that nobody can pray to any god or any human being other than the king in these 30 days. And if they did pray, then they need to be thrown in the lion's den. They wanted the king to put this in writing and to seal it. And so King Darius, he did that, but he didn't think about that about Daniel. He says, now, your majesty, issue the decree in that 8th verse of Daniel 6. They said, now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So they're getting this thing rolled up. Your enemies will come to you, but go through legal authorities to get it done, and then come up against you to make it seem like an appeal to leadership that is something good that's being done. But this was something that was evil that was being done. But the story goes on to tell you that they threw him in the lion's den with this sovereign Persian law that could not be altered, could not be repealed, and had to be carried out. And this is what they're standing on in the book of Esther. This law has been written, it's Persian, cannot be repealed, cannot be revoked, it has to be carried out. King Darius threw Daniel in the lion's den, but guess what? We know the story. God saved Daniel out of the lion's den. And so God will save us. And then guess what? The men who came up against with this evil plan, they were thrown in the lion's den. And then after they were thrown in the lion's den, the lions ate them, started eating them before they could even hit the ground because they were just that hungry. An angel had gone in the night before and saved Daniel. The King Darius was worried because he liked Daniel, and he went to see if Daniel was okay. And Daniel called up and said his God had saved him. Won't God do it? All we got to do is just stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Let God handle it. And that's what had happened in the case of Mordecai. The sovereign hand of God had saved him. And now the sovereign hand of God is still going to save the Israelite people. And so Esther had done what she's supposed to do. She's going to appeal to this sense of morality in this king, because even though there's a law, we know that there's a moral standard and that these people were dying innocently. But even if it's a law, there's an out clause that God can give. God can give an out clause for your situation when God steps in. So Esther's going to appeal to this moral sense. She's come before him. She's appealed to him. She's shown him the respect. And God calls us to act obedient, even though we may face consequences. When we stand for what God stands for, if we face consequences, we still have to do as the leading of the Lord says. Esther's going to appeal to this king. He's given out that golden scepter. She's come before him again. And so she's here to make her request known, because this evil thing that Haman has done is still there. So the king has good feelings towards Esther. It says, if it please the king, is what she says, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes. She wanted something from the king. She wanted the king to override this decree that Haman had put in writing. She says, how can I endure to see the evil that shall come unto my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? So she's appealing to the king's heart in this matter. Don't matter about this edict. She's not just going on her emotions. She's talking about what's been done, and you got to do what's right. And she referred to it not as the king's edict, but this thing has been done by Haman. So she's putting the blame where the blame was. And the king saw her. When you got something that needs to go, gotta make people see you. I'm not just talking about see you in your physical sense, but I'm talking about see what is troubling you in your heart. So God has a plan in place. Esther had the plan of how to do this, but God is still working in his sovereignty. And so let's look at the answer, and let's look at Esther 8, because God is moving. Let's look at Esther 8, and let's read verses 7 through 8. It says, then the king Ahasuerus said unto Esther the queen, and to Mordecai, because what has happened that in that, before we get to the starting of this, what's happened is that it says in Esther 8, King Ahasuerus has given Queen Esther the house of Haman. So she's gotten what was Haman's, and the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and he gave it to Mordecai. And he gave Mordecai Haman's position. So that goes back to that prophetic word that I told you about. And when God can use anybody to decree something into the atmosphere. And when they had said it in that 6th chapter of Esther, it said, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. And he had. And now Mordecai has what Haman had. So it is here that the king has told her that when Mordecai was promoted, he's promoted. And it says that, behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman. I'm in that 7th verse again. And him they have hanged upon the gallows, because he laid his hands upon the Jews. Now this is what the king says. He says, now, you got my signet ring, is what he's saying to Mordecai, and he's reminding them of this. You got my signet ring. Now, write ye also for the Jews, as it liketh you, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring. For the writing which is written in the king's name, and sealed with the king's ring, may no man reverse. So you can't reverse it. You can't reverse it. But you can write another decree, because I got you. I promoted you, Mordecai, and you can override it, because I have given you the authority to do it. You got my signet ring. When God gives you the authority to do something, when God gives you the power to do something, then you can operate in that power and that authority that God has given you. Esther promoted Mordecai to be over the property of Haman. And so Mordecai has this power. Haman plotted genocide, but now who's been lifted up and who's gone because of wrongdoing, because of evil that was in his heart? So it's been made clear to Mordecai that you got power, use it. The decree Haman sent out can't be revoked, but you can write another edict to get it revoked. You got a signet ring, Mordecai. All he's got to do is use the stamp on what he puts out. So the king's telling him, operate in that power. God has given us power, and he tells us, operate in that power. And so what happens is that what are the reasons that the king might have favored Esther? It could have been her beauty, it could have been her humility, it could have been her respect, could have been anything. But his heart, the heart is in the hand of the king, is in the hand of God. And he had given her that access that she needed. So all Mordecai had to do was to rewrite the decree. Rewrite the decree. So Mordecai was to rewrite it. The Jews, when he write it, the Jews would be allowed to gather together to defend themselves, since they couldn't strike down what Haman had done on the day of that attack that would come on the 13th. Since that decree could not be taken down, that edict could not be taken down, then they set up this plan. Mordecai, he wrote another edict, and it was that they could annihilate any of the forces that came up against them. They didn't have to spare women or children, and then they could plunder the possessions of the Persians. They sent this decree out. And so even when evil can't be undone, measures for mitigating it or working around it are almost always possible. So the victory for the Jews began really with prayer and that humility that was there with Esther and with Mordecai. God can move in his sovereign power. God can do whatever he wants to do. So here one has been lifted up in pride in what he had, and now he's been taken down. The person that he wanted to destroy now has his position, and this man is now Mordecai, and Mordecai is going to help save the Jews. So let's look at the Jews' joy, and let's look at celebration, and let's read Esther 9:18 through 19. It says, "But the Jews that were at Shushan assembled together on that 13th day thereof, and on that 14th day thereof, and on the 15th day of the same, they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages that dealt in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month of Adar a day of gladness and of feasting, and a good day, and of sending portions one to another." So what has happened now is that Haman's decree, although it could not be cast down, that decree was overridden. A plan was put in place that the Jews could defend themselves. So it's the day has gone by, and that 13th day, and the Jews have fought back, and they won. They defeated those Persians that were coming up against them, and fear went out. Again, here is God who's taking care of his people, and the fear of the Jews again is out. And so even the government officials had helped the Jews to fight up against those who were fighting up against them. 500 Persian men in Shushan died. And the 10 sons of Haman were hanged on the gallows. Queen Esther, she had petitioned to the king, and so this has all taken place because the authority that had been both given to Esther and the authority that had been given to Mordecai. God had changed the situation for the Jews, and now the enemies of the Jews were afraid of them. The Jews had had that long history where people hated them, and now they're to the point of where now there's a time for celebration. The nations who the nation who had suffered, when you suffer some things and go through some things, you appreciate it better, because when you're going through suffering, you need the help of the Lord, and the Lord had helped them through the things that they had gone through. That 13th day was the day of Adar. That was the day that Haman's decree had gone out that the Jews were to be killed. And so the king had extended the day for the Jews in Shushan, that they still could attack on that 14th day. And so they attacked. But the other Jews that were living outside of Shushan, they were celebrating. They had celebrated. They had celebrated. And that 15th day, all the killing stopped. And so the extension of the attack, it was only to like I said, those in Shushan, but the rest of the Jews on that 14th day were celebrating. And so this thing it was so much that the Lord was in the favor of the Jews, that even the people that were living outside of the walls that were Jews, they were not afraid. Psalms 35 says, God's anger endureth but for a moment. In his favor is life. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. And we know about that saying. We say it a lot. Joy comes in the morning. It's good to set aside times to remember when we have experienced deliverance from evil and danger. And that's what Mordecai is doing here, causing the people to remember what happened to you. Don't forget what happened to you. It's good to know that there is hope for deliverance when we're in bad situations, and we know joy will come. That's why we talk about joy comes in the morning. Amen. Joy comes in the morning. So let's look at the communication. Let's look at Esther 9 verses 20 through 21. And it said, because Mordecai has set this thing up, that he wants you to remember what happened. He set it up. He wants you to know what happened to you during this time. He wants to make this a time of celebration, that you will forever remember this. You will forever observe this time. It says, and Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters unto all the Jews that were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both nigh and far, to establish this amongst them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and the 15th day of the same yearly. So Mordecai wants this thing to be established. He has this historical record written of this event. He sent a letter to all the Jews in the provinces. The 14th and the 15th day are annual celebrations. He sent letters out to the provinces. Is his plan? This day has come to be known as the day Feast of Purim, and then it's named after the lot that was cast to discern to make this genocide happen under Haman. And the naming of this day is just to remind the people of what Haman tried to do with his wicked act, and then how God had given them the victory over it. And so Mordecai is doing what he's supposed to do. He did it when the people were in threat, he and Esther. And so good leaders will make sure that significant events in life of their people are commemorated in the future. And so this Feast of Purim is established. It's not talked about in the New Testament, but it is in the Old Testament. It's talked about in the apocryphal literature and by Josephus. And so they celebrate it. It's not celebrated like as a national feast, so they don't go to Jerusalem, but locally where the Jews are, they would celebrate it. And so when they would celebrate it, even to today, they would read the book of Esther and read the book of Esther, and then when Haman's name is read, now it's like the people would hiss, they would use noise makers, they would stomp their feet to drown out the name of Haman. So from that time that it was established by Mordecai all the way to present, it's still celebrated. And so when deliverance comes to people, they need to celebrate. As Christians, we have a deliverance that has come to us by Jesus Christ. When he died at a great price on that cross, he gave his life for us, and we need to remember what Jesus did for us. They have the custom that is in the church that they will do the communion in remembrance of him. And so the thing that God wants is for us to remember when good things have been done for us. So let's look at this commemoration, and let's look at Esther 9:22 through 23. It says, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another and gifts to the poor. And the Jews undertook to do as they had begun, and as Mordecai had written unto them. So Mordecai, he went further to explain this even more, why he wanted this holiday here. The 14th again and the 15th days of Adar, they were to rest because they were resting from being pursued by enemies. The sorrows had turned to joy. The mourning was to be happiness. They were to celebrate God's goodness. They were times of feasting and to exchange gifts and to give to the poor. The Jews' response was they accepted what was to be done, that it was a positive acceptance of this as a day of observance. They would accept what Mordecai wanted to be done annually, to keep it up, to keep up what was to be done. They would make sure that the next generation would never forget what God wanted done. And then they would make sure that everybody that was Jewish knew what was happening, and that they would take care of it all. They were going to do it the way that God wanted it done, the way that Mordecai wanted it done. They would get the letters to the Jews about this to make sure that it continued annually. Took great effort to do it because they didn't have internet. They didn't have airplanes. They didn't have cars to get this out. It took a great amount of time, but they got it done. This is the word of the Lord today, and this is a word for anybody that's facing enemies. Don't try to fight up against your enemies. Just walk in the things of God. Keep walking in God. God will deal with your enemies. As we see how God took care of the Jews that Haman had tried to kill, and how God had defeated the enemies that wanted to come up against his people. God gave deliverance to the Jews, and God will give deliverance to you when you're facing a battle. I thank you for watching the Sunday school lesson. I pray that you found something in it that's helpful. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe to my channel and tell somebody about Valerie Laurie Ministries. I thank those of you that have reached out to me during the time that I have been ill. I appreciate what you've done, and I thank you for watching the videos. I pray the Lord will watch over all of you, and that we can meet again on next week. I pray that you find something that's helpful to you in these videos, and that it helps to uplift your day. So until we meet again, be blessed in the Lord, and bye bye.